The haunting melody of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major drifted through the crisp autumn air, each note carrying the weight of untold stories and forgotten dreams. Marcus Thompson's weathered fingers danced across the portable keyboard he had set up on the corner of 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, where the shadows of towering skyscrapers created a natural amphitheater for his daily performances. Passers-by hurried past, their faces buried in smartphones and their minds occupied with the relentless pace of New York City life. But the music seemed to slow time itself, creating pockets of serenity in the urban chaos. The worn bills and scattered coins in his open guitar case told the story of a man who had chosen art over comfort, passion over security, and music over the conventional path that society had mapped out for him. For 3 years, Marcus had called these streets his concert hall, transforming the concrete jungle into his personal Carnegie Hall, with nothing more than his talent and an unwavering belief in the power of music to heal wounded souls. His dark hair, now streaked with premature silver at the temples, caught the late afternoon sunlight as he swayed gently with the rhythm of his own creation. The calluses on his fingertips bore witness to countless hours of practice, and his deep brown eyes held a wisdom that could only come from understanding both the beauty and the brutality of life. He had graduated magna cum laude from Juilliard 7 years ago, with dreams of performing in the world's most prestigious venues, but life had dealt him a different hand, one that led him here, to this corner, where he discovered that true artistry wasn't about the grandeur of the stage, but about the intimate connection between musician and listener, between heart and soul. As the final notes of the nocturne faded into the evening air, Marcus noticed an elderly gentleman standing motionless at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered around his makeshift performance space. The man was distinguished in a way that spoke of old money and refined taste, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the wind, and his navy wool coat bearing the subtle signs of quality craftsmanship that had endured decades of wear. What struck Marcus most profoundly was the expression on the stranger's face, a mixture of profound sadness and recognition, as if the music had unlocked a door to memories that had been carefully sealed away. The man's pale blue eyes glistened with unshed tears, and his trembling hands clutched a leather portfolio against his chest with the protective instinct of someone guarding their most precious possession. As their eyes met across the small crowd, Marcus felt an inexplicable connection, a recognition that went beyond the superficial interaction between performer and audience member, as if the music had created an invisible bridge between two souls who shared a common understanding of loss and longing. The crowd began to disperse as the daylight faded, but the elderly gentleman remained rooted to his spot, seemingly unable or unwilling to break the spell that the music had cast over him. Marcus carefully closed the lid of his keyboard and began packing his equipment, but he could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze upon him, urgent and pleading in a way that transcended words. When Marcus finally looked up again, the man was approaching slowly, his steps measured and deliberate, as if he were walking across sacred ground that demanded reverence and respect. "Young man," the stranger said, his voice carrying the refined accent of someone educated in an era when elocution was considered an art form, "that piece you just played, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, where did you learn to interpret it with such profound understanding of its melancholy?" The question hung in the air between them, like a musical phrase waiting for resolution, and Marcus could sense that his answer would determine whether this chance encounter would bloom into something meaningful or fade away like so many other brief connections made and lost in the endless flow of city life. As Marcus looked into the stranger's eyes, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat, a reflection of his own journey through abandonment and redemption, mirrored in the face of someone who had traveled much further down that difficult path. "I learned it from the silence between the notes," Marcus replied softly, his words carrying the weight of personal experience. "From understanding that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the places where we've been broken." The elderly man's face crumpled slightly, and he extended a trembling hand toward Marcus, introducing himself as Professor Edmund Hartwell, a name that would soon become synonymous with the most transformative chapter of Marcus's life. The two men stood there in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the sounds of the city, but somehow isolated in their own bubble of shared understanding, as if fate had orchestrated this meeting with the precision of a master composer arranging the elements of a symphony. What stories would unfold from this chance encounter? What secrets lay hidden in Professor Hartwell's past? And how would Marcus's music become the key to unlocking them? Tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Is it day or night in your corner of the world? And what kind of story would you love to hear next about the magical power of music to heal and transform? The invitation came 3 days later, delivered by hand in an envelope of cream-colored paper, so thick and luxurious that Marcus could feel its quality between his fingertips before he even broke the wax seal that bore an intricate monogram of intertwined letters EH. Professor Edmund Hartwell's elegant script filled the page with words that seemed to dance across the paper like musical notes. Dear Mr. Thompson, your interpretation of Chopin has awakened something in me that I thought had died long ago. Would you honor an old man with your presence this Saturday afternoon at 3 p.m.? I have something to show you that I believe will speak to your soul as profoundly as your music spoke to mine. The address listed was in the Upper East Side, in a neighborhood where Marcus had only ventured as a curious tourist, marveling at the brownstones and mansions that housed New York's cultural elite. Saturday arrived wrapped in the golden light of late October, and Marcus found himself standing before an imposing 4-story brownstone that spoke of an era when craftsmanship was an art form and attention to detail was a matter of personal pride. The building's facade was adorned with intricate stone carvings that depicted musical instruments and flowing ribbons of melody frozen in time, while the heavy oak door featured stained glass panels that caught the afternoon sunlight and scattered rainbows across the entrance steps. Professor Hartwell answered the door himself, dressed in a burgundy velvet smoking jacket that had clearly been tailored decades ago but maintained with meticulous care, and his eyes held a mixture of excitement and apprehension that made Marcus wonder what secrets lay hidden within these walls. "Welcome, my dear boy," the professor said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I must confess that I haven't had a visitor in far too long. Please come in and prepare yourself for a journey through time itself." The interior of the townhouse was a shrine to musical history, with every wall lined with glass cases containing rare manuscripts, vintage instruments, and photographs of legendary performers from bygone eras. Marcus walked through the rooms as if he were touring a private museum, his eyes wide with wonder as he took in original compositions by Mozart, a violin that had belonged to Paganini, and concert programs from performances that had taken place before his grandparents were born. Professor Hartwell watched Marcus's reaction with the intensity of someone studying a rare and precious specimen, and Marcus could sense that this tour was both a privilege and a test, as if the professor were determining whether Marcus was worthy of whatever revelation lay ahead. "My father began this collection in 1923, the professor explained, his voice growing stronger as he shared the history of his family's passion, and I have spent my entire life adding to it, preserving these treasures not just as objects, but as vessels that contain the very essence of human emotion and artistic achievement. But Marcus, what I'm about to show you, this is the heart of everything, the room that gave birth to my love of music, and that has been silent for far too long." They climbed a narrow staircase to the 4th floor, and with each step, Marcus could feel the weight of anticipation building in his chest, like the crescendo of a symphony approaching its climax. Professor Hartwell paused before a heavy wooden door that bore signs of age and disuse, his hand hovering over the brass handle, as if touching it would unleash forces that he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. "This was my father's recording studio," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "where he captured the performances of the greatest musicians of his generation, where magic was made and preserved for posterity. But it's been sealed for 15 years, ever since." He couldn't finish the sentence, and Marcus watched as the old man's shoulders sagged under the weight of memories too painful to voice. When the door finally opened, the musty scent of abandonment rushed out to greet them, carrying with it the ghost of melodies that had once filled this space with life and joy, and the ineffable beauty that only music can create. The studio was a tomb of forgotten dreams, its once magnificent recording equipment now shrouded in dust sheets like mourners at a funeral, while cobwebs stretched between vintage microphones that had once captured the voices of angels and the fingers of masters. The grand piano in the center of the room sat silent and neglected, its ebony surface dulled by years of neglect, and Marcus could almost hear the echoes of all the music that had once poured forth from its keys like liquid gold. Professor Hartwell stood in the doorway, unable or unwilling to step inside, his eyes scanning the room with the expression of someone revisiting the scene of a great tragedy, and Marcus understood without being told that this place represented both the pinnacle of the professor's happiness and the source of his deepest grief. "My son David was going to take over the studio," the professor finally managed to say, his voice breaking like a piece of crystal hitting stone. "But he died in Afghanistan 7 years ago, and I couldn't bear to hear music in this room anymore. I sealed it away, thinking that silence would be easier than the constant reminder of everything we had planned together." The revelation hung in the air between them like a funeral dirge, and Marcus felt his heart breaking for this man who had chosen abandonment over the risk of further pain, who had sacrificed his passion to protect his wounded soul. Can you imagine the courage it takes to step back into a place where your dreams once lived? Share with us in the comments what time of day you're reading this story, and what kind of musical memory holds the most meaning in your life. The silence in the abandoned studio was deafening, filled with the weight of unrealized potential, and dreams deferred by grief's cruel hand. But Marcus felt something stirring within him, a recognition that this wasn't just a room filled with dusty equipment, but a sanctuary waiting to be reborn. He stepped across the threshold, despite Professor Hartwell's hesitation, his footsteps echoing in the space like the first notes of a composition that had been waiting years to be played. And as he moved deeper into the room, he could feel the ghosts of melodies that had once danced through the air like living spirits. The dust motes caught in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed to swirl in patterns that reminded him of musical notation, and Marcus found himself humming softly under his breath, a wordless tune that seemed to emerge from the very soul of the room itself. Professor Hartwell watched from the doorway with a mixture of terror and fascination, as if Marcus were performing some kind of musical exorcism that might either heal the wounds of the past or tear them open beyond repair. Marcus approached the shrouded grand piano with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a sacred shrine, and when he gently pulled away the dust sheet, he gasped at the beauty that lay beneath. A magnificent Steinway Model D concert grand that gleamed like polished obsidian despite its years of neglect. The instrument was a work of art in itself, its curves flowing like frozen music, and Marcus could see his reflection in its lustrous surface as clearly as if he were looking into a mirror that showed not just his physical form, but the essence of his musical soul. He lifted the lid carefully, almost ceremoniously, and the afternoon light fell across the ivory and ebony keys like a benediction, revealing an instrument that had been crafted by masters and maintained with the kind of love that transcends mere ownership. "She's beautiful," Marcus whispered, his voice filled with awe and reverence. "Even after all these years, she's still beautiful." Professor Hartwell's eyes filled with tears as he heard the genuine appreciation in Marcus's voice, and for the first time in 7 years, he allowed himself to remember the joy that this room had once brought him, rather than focusing solely on the pain of its abandonment. The young street musician placed his fingers tentatively on the keys, testing their responsiveness with the gentle touch of someone greeting an old friend after a long separation, and the notes that emerged were slightly out of tune, but rich with harmonic possibilities that spoke of an instrument yearning to fulfill its purpose once again. Marcus began to play a simple melody, nothing complex or showy, just a gentle exploration of the piano's voice that gradually grew in confidence and complexity as he discovered the unique character and personality of this magnificent instrument. The music seemed to awaken the room itself, causing the dust to dance in the sunbeams and the cobwebs to shimmer like silver threads, and Professor Hartwell found himself stepping forward into the studio for the first time in 7 years, drawn by the irresistible magnetism of melody, returning to a place where it belonged. Each note seemed to breathe new life into the abandoned space, and Marcus could feel the room responding to his touch, like a garden awakening after a long winter, ready to bloom again under the nurturing care of someone who understood its true value. As the music filled the studio, Professor Hartwell's resistance began to crumble like walls built of sand, facing an incoming tide, and he moved closer to the piano with steps that grew more confident with each passing measure of Marcus's improvised composition. The young musician looked up at the elderly collector, with eyes that sparkled with possibility and hope, and in that moment, both men understood that they had discovered something precious, not just a shared love of music, but a chance for healing that neither had expected to find. "Professor," Marcus said softly, his hands still moving gently across the keys. "This studio doesn't want to remain silent forever. I can feel it in every note, in every resonance. This room was meant to be filled with music, and your son's memory deserves to be honored not with silence, but with the kind of beauty that he would have created here." The words hung in the air like a musical phrase awaiting resolution, and Professor Hartwell felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight bands of grief that had constricted his heart for so many years. The afternoon sun began to slant lower through the windows, casting long golden rectangles across the studio floor and illuminating particles of dust that seemed to dance in celebration of the music that had returned to this sacred space. Professor Hartwell approached the piano bench and sat down beside Marcus, his trembling hands joining the younger man's on the keyboard in a four-handed improvisation that bridged the gap between generations and transformed shared sorrow into something approaching joy. Together, they created music that was neither technically perfect nor professionally polished, but was infused with an emotional authenticity that spoke to the deepest chambers of the human heart. And as they played, both men could feel the studio itself beginning to remember its purpose and its power. The equipment that had stood silent for so long seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the microphones and mixing boards and recording devices were eager to capture and preserve the beautiful sounds that were once again filling the air with life and meaning. "Marcus," Professor Hartwell said, as their impromptu duet came to a natural conclusion, "would you consider helping an old man bring this place back to life? I think David would have wanted his studio to sing again." The invitation was more than just a request for assistance. It was an offering of trust, a sharing of sacred space, and the beginning of a partnership that would transform both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. What do you think it takes to turn abandonment into renewal? Tell us in the comments whether you're reading this during your morning coffee or your evening wind-down, and share what kind of music helps you heal during difficult times. The transformation began the very next morning, when Marcus arrived at the brownstone carrying a toolbox borrowed from his landlord and a heart full of determination that burned brighter than the autumn sun streaming through the studio windows. Professor Hartwell had spent a sleepless night pacing the floors of his townhouse, alternating between excitement and terror as he contemplated the magnitude of what they were about to undertake, not just the physical restoration of equipment and instruments, but the emotional resurrection of a space that held the concentrated essence of his deepest joys and most profound sorrows. When Marcus knocked on the door at precisely 8 o'clock, the professor greeted him wearing work clothes that looked like they had been purchased decades ago and never worn, their pristine condition a testament to a man who had spent his life surrounded by beautiful things, but had rarely gotten his hands dirty in their creation or maintenance. "I'm afraid I'm not much use with tools," Professor Hartwell admitted with a sheepish smile, "but I know every piece of equipment in that studio like they were my own children, and I can tell you stories about each one that will make you understand why they deserve to live again." Their first task was to catalogue the damage and assess what could be salvaged, a process that revealed both heartbreaking losses and miraculous survivals that seemed to follow no logical pattern, but rather the whimsical rules of fate and fortune. The vintage Neumann microphones that had recorded some of the most legendary vocalists of the 1960s were tarnished, but structurally sound, their delicate diaphragms still intact despite years of neglect, while the state-of-the-art digital mixing console that Professor Hartwell had purchased just months before sealing the studio had succumbed to moisture damage and would need to be completely rebuilt. Marcus worked with the methodical precision of someone who understood that restoration was as much about patience as it was about skill, carefully cleaning each piece of equipment while Professor Hartwell shared the history behind every microphone, every amplifier, every length of cable that had once carried the electric current of human creativity from instrument to recording medium. The stories flowed like music themselves, tales of late-night recording sessions that stretched until dawn, of temperamental artists who demanded perfection and the technical wizardry required to capture lightning in a bottle, of moments when everything aligned perfectly, and magic was born from the marriage of talent, technology, and divine inspiration. As they worked side by side, Marcus began to understand that he was not just helping to restore a recording studio, but participating in the reconstruction of a man's shattered relationship with his own passion and purpose. Professor Hartwell's hands, which had trembled with emotion and uncertainty just days before, grew steadier as he handled the familiar equipment, and his voice gained strength as he shared memories that he had buried beneath layers of protective silence for far too long. The old man's knowledge was encyclopedic and passionate, spanning decades of technological advancement and artistic evolution, and Marcus found himself learning not just about recording techniques and equipment maintenance, but about the deeper philosophy of music preservation and the sacred responsibility that came with capturing and protecting the ephemeral beauty of human artistic expression. Each cleaned microphone and restored amplifier represented a small victory against the forces of entropy and abandonment, a declaration that beauty and creativity were worth fighting for, even when, especially when, they had been wounded by tragedy and loss. The breakthrough came on the third day, when they successfully powered up the vintage tube amplifiers that formed the heart of the studio's analog recording chain, and the warm, golden glow of the vacuum tubes painted the room in light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a sleeping giant's heartbeat. The sight of those glowing tubes brought tears to Professor Hartwell's eyes, and he reached out to touch the metal chassis with the tenderness of someone greeting a beloved friend who had returned from a long and dangerous journey, while Marcus watched in awe as the old man seemed to shed years of accumulated grief with each piece of equipment they brought back to life. "You know," Professor Hartwell said, his voice thick with emotion, as he adjusted the bias settings on an amplifier with the muscle memory of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. David used to say that analog equipment had souls, that the tubes and transformers and capacitors somehow captured not just the electrical signal, but the spiritual essence of the music itself. I used to think it was romantic nonsense, but now I think he was right. These machines remember the music they've recorded, and they've been waiting all these years for someone to wake them up and let them sing again. The studio began to hum with renewed life as more systems came online, and Marcus could feel the space transforming around them like a photograph slowly developing in a darkroom, revealing details and textures that had been hidden in the shadows of neglect and abandonment. The sound of the air conditioning system cycling on for the first time in years was like the first breath of a newborn, and when they tested the studio monitors and heard the first clear, undistorted audio signal emerge from speakers that had been silent for so long, both men stood in reverent silence as if they were witnessing a miracle. Professor Hartwell placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder with the weight of gratitude and newfound hope, and in that moment, the young street musician understood that he had become part of something much larger than a simple restoration project. He had become a guardian of musical heritage, a keeper of dreams and a catalyst for healing that extended far beyond the walls of this magnificent studio. The room itself seemed to approve of their efforts, as the late afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the polished surfaces of the restored equipment and painted everything in gold, creating an atmosphere that felt both sacred and celebratory, as if the universe itself was acknowledging their work and blessing their mission. As they stood together in the glow of the restored studio, surrounded by the quiet hum of equipment, ready to capture the next generation of musical magic, both men knew that they were no longer just restoring a room. They were rebuilding their faith in the power of music to heal, to connect, and to transform even the deepest wounds into something beautiful. What role does music play in your own healing journey? Tell us in the comments what time zone you're reading from, and share a moment when music helped you through a difficult time in your life. The first recording session in 7 years was scheduled for a crisp November morning, and Marcus arrived at the studio before dawn to find Professor Hartwell already there, standing before the grand piano with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that reminded the young musician of a performer preparing for the most important concert of his life. The studio had been transformed over the past 2 weeks into a shrine of technological perfection and aesthetic beauty, with every surface polished to a mirror shine and every piece of equipment calibrated with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. But more importantly, the space now thrummed with an almost palpable sense of purpose and possibility that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the brass fittings of the vintage microphones and created patterns of gold and shadow that danced across the studio floor like musical notation written in light, while the gentle hum of the tube amplifiers provided a constant bass note that served as the heartbeat of this reborn sanctuary. Professor Hartwell had chosen this day carefully. It was the anniversary of David's birth, and he had decided that there could be no more fitting tribute to his son's memory than to fill the studio once again with the kind of music that had inspired them both to dedicate their lives to the preservation and celebration of human artistic achievement. Marcus seated himself at the restored Steinway and began his pre-recording ritual, a series of gentle scales and arpeggios that served both to warm up his fingers and to establish a connection with the instrument that would be essential for the emotional authenticity of the performance they were about to capture. The piano responded to his touch like a thoroughbred racehorse eager to run, its voice rich and complex, with overtones that seemed to fill every corner of the studio with warmth and resonance, and Professor Hartwell watched from the control room with the intensity of someone witnessing a resurrection, his hands moving unconsciously over the familiar controls of the mixing console as if he were inducting an invisible orchestra. The sight of the old man in his element, surrounded by the tools of his trade, and radiating the quiet confidence that came from decades of experience in capturing musical magic, filled Marcus with a sense of profound gratitude and responsibility. He understood that he was not just performing for himself or even for Professor Hartwell, but for the ghost of David Hartwell and for all the musicians who had poured their souls into this room over the years. The weight of that legacy could have been crushing, but instead it felt like wings, lifting Marcus to a level of artistic expression that he had never achieved on the busy street corners of Manhattan. The piece they had chosen for this inaugural recording was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same composition that had brought them together on that fateful autumn afternoon when two wounded souls had recognized each other across the divide of age and experience and circumstance. As Marcus began to play, the familiar melody took on new dimensions in the acoustically perfect environment of the studio, with every subtle nuance and emotional inflection captured by the vintage Neumann microphones and processed through the warm, musical distortion of the tube-driven recording chain that Professor Hartwell had spent decades perfecting. The music seemed to flow not just from Marcus's fingers, but from some deeper source within the room itself, as if the studio were adding its own voice to the performance, contributing the accumulated wisdom and experience of all the sessions that had taken place within these walls over the years. Professor Hartwell sat transfixed at the mixing console, his eyes closed, and his head swaying gently with the rhythm of the nocturne, and Marcus could see tears streaming down the old man's face as the music worked its transformative magic on both performer and listener, healing wounds that had seemed too deep to ever fully close. The recording process became a meditation on the nature of time and memory, as each take revealed new layers of meaning and emotion that neither man had expected to discover in a piece of music they both thought they knew by heart. Professor Hartwell's expertise in capturing and shaping sound proved to be the perfect complement to Marcus's intuitive understanding of musical expression, and together they created something that transcended the sum of its parts, a recording that captured not just the notes and rhythms of Chopin's composition, but the emotional journey of two men learning to trust in beauty again after being ended by loss and disappointment. The vintage equipment added its own character to the recording, imparting a warmth and depth that modern digital systems could never quite replicate, and as they listened to the playback through the restored studio monitors, both men understood that they had created something truly special, not just a technically excellent recording, but a document of healing, a testament to the power of music to bridge the gap between past and present, between sorrow and joy, between abandonment and renewal. As the final notes of the nocturne faded into the perfect silence of the acoustically treated studio, Professor Hartwell emerged from the control room with tears of joy streaming down his face and embraced Marcus with the fervor of a man who had just witnessed a miracle. "David would have loved this," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "He would have been so proud of what we've accomplished here, of how his studio has come back to life in ways more beautiful than we ever imagined possible." The two men stood together in the afternoon light that slanted through the windows and painted everything in gold, surrounded by the gentle hum of equipment that was once again fulfilling its purpose. And Marcus realized that they had achieved something far more significant than the restoration of a recording studio. They had proven that abandonment need not be permanent, that with patience and dedication and love, even the most wounded places could be made whole again. The studio itself seemed to pulse with renewed vitality, as if it were breathing again after years of holding its breath, and the sound of their successful recording seemed to echo in the air long after the speakers had fallen silent, a promise that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in the long and storied history of this magnificent space. Professor Hartwell looked around the studio with eyes that sparkled with plans and possibilities, and Marcus knew that their partnership was just beginning, that together they would fill this room with music that would honor the past while creating something entirely new for the future. Have you ever experienced a moment when something you thought was lost forever suddenly came back to life? Share with us in the comments what part of the world you're reading from right now, and tell us about a time when music helped you rediscover hope after a period of darkness. Word of the restored studio spread through New York's musical underground like wildfire, carried by the whispered recommendations of session musicians and sound engineers who had heard rumors of the legendary Hartwell Studios rising from the ashes of its own abandonment. Within a month of their first successful recording, Marcus and Professor Hartwell found themselves fielding inquiries from artists who ranged from struggling singer-songwriters seeking the perfect acoustic environment for their demos to established jazz ensembles looking for a recording space that could capture the warmth and intimacy of their music without sacrificing technical excellence. The professor approached each potential booking with the careful deliberation of someone curating a museum exhibition, turning away clients whose artistic vision didn't align with his standards for musical integrity, and welcoming those who understood that they were entering not just a recording studio, but a sacred space where music was treated as something approaching a religious experience. Marcus watched with growing admiration as the old man transformed from a grief-stricken recluse into a passionate advocate for artistic excellence, his eyes lighting up with renewed purpose each time a new musician walked through the studio doors and gasped at the beauty and sophistication of the equipment that surrounded them. The first major session came in December, when a young violinist named Elena Vasquez brought her string quartet to record a collection of contemporary classical pieces that she had composed as a tribute to her grandmother's stories of life in pre-revolutionary Cuba. Marcus served as both technical assistant and artistic collaborator, his growing expertise in studio operations perfectly complementing his intuitive understanding of how to create an environment where musicians could access their deepest creative reserves without the distractions and pressures that plagued less thoughtfully designed recording spaces. Professor Hartwell worked his magic from behind the mixing console, positioning microphones with the precision of a surgeon and adjusting signal levels with the sensitivity of a poet, while the vintage tube equipment added its own subtle coloration to the sound, transforming Elena's already beautiful compositions into something that seemed to glow with inner light. The recording sessions stretched over 3 days, with each musician pushing the others to new heights of artistic expression, and Marcus found himself learning not just about recording techniques, but about the alchemy that occurred when talented artists were given the tools and environment they needed to fully realize their creative vision. As winter deepened and the studio's reputation continued to grow, Marcus began to understand that he had stumbled into something far more significant than a part-time job or even a partnership. He had found his calling, his purpose, his place in the vast ecosystem of musical creation and preservation that connected him to centuries of artists who had dedicated their lives to capturing and sharing the ineffable beauty of human expression through sound. Professor Hartwell had become both mentor and father figure, teaching Marcus not just the technical aspects of recording, but the deeper philosophy behind their work, explaining how each piece of equipment served not just a functional purpose, but an artistic one, how the choice of microphone or amplifier or recording medium could fundamentally alter the emotional impact of a performance. The old man's encyclopedic knowledge of recording history provided context for everything they did, connecting their daily work to the broader narrative of how recorded music had evolved from Edison's first cylinders to the sophisticated digital systems that most modern studios employed, and Marcus began to appreciate the profound responsibility that came with serving as a guardian of this techno-logical and artistic heritage. The transformation in Professor Hartwell was as remarkable as the resurrection of the studio itself, as the grief-stricken recluse evolved into something resembling his former self, a passionate educator and mentor who had rediscovered his love for sharing knowledge and nurturing talent in the next generation of musical artists and technicians. His conversations with visiting musicians revealed a depth of understanding about music theory, acoustics, and recording techniques that spanned multiple decades and genres, and Marcus watched with growing respect as the professor guided young artists through the technical and emotional challenges of translating their creative vision into recorded form. The old man's hands, which had trembled with uncertainty and sorrow just months before, now moved across the mixing console with the confident precision of someone who had found his way back to his true calling, and his eyes sparkled with the kind of joy that could only come from knowing that his life's work had meaning and value beyond his own personal satisfaction. The studio had become not just a business, but a community gathering place where musicians could connect with each other and with the rich history of recorded music, and Marcus realized that they had created something that honored David Hartwell's memory far more effectively than any monument or memorial could have done. The year's end brought reflection and planning, as Marcus and Professor Hartwell sat in the studio on New Year's Eve, surrounded by the gentle hum of equipment that had been brought back to life through their shared dedication and vision. The walls were now lined with gold and platinum records from the sessions they had recorded over the past few months, each one representing not just commercial success, but artistic achievement of the highest order, and the two men looked around their domain with the satisfied exhaustion of farmers surveying a successful harvest. Professor Hartwell had begun talking about expanding their operation, perhaps converting one of the unused rooms on the third floor into a mastering suite, or installing additional isolation booths to accommodate larger ensembles. But Marcus knew that the real success they had achieved couldn't be measured in square footage or equipment upgrades. They had proved that abandonment was not a permanent state, that with patience and love and unwavering commitment to excellence, even the most wounded places could be restored to their former glory and beyond. The studio pulsed with life and purpose around them, and as the clock struck midnight and fireworks exploded over the city outside, both men understood that they had not just restored a recording studio, they had restored their faith in the possibility of renewal, in the power of music to heal, and in the fundamental human capacity to create beauty from the ashes of loss and disappointment. As we begin this new chapter of their story, what dreams are you working to restore in your own life? Tell us in the comments whether you're celebrating the new year or reflecting on the old one, and share with us what kind of creative project has been calling to your heart but waiting for the right moment to begin. The challenge that would test the true strength of their partnership arrived on a grey February morning in the form of Rebecca Sterling, a Grammy-winning producer whose reputation for perfectionism was matched only by her ability to extract extraordinary performances from even the most difficult artists. She swept into the studio like a force of nature, her sharp eyes cataloguing every piece of equipment with the calculating precision of a general surveying a battlefield, and Marcus could feel the temperature in the room drop several degrees as she subjected their carefully restored vintage gear to the kind of scrutiny that had made her legendary in an industry where technical excellence was the rice of admission. Professor Hartwell watched nervously from the corner as Rebecca ran her hands over the mixing console and peered inside the tube amplifiers, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts, and Marcus found himself holding his breath as he waited for her verdict on whether their beloved studio would meet the exacting standards of someone who had worked with the biggest names in the music business. "I've heard the rumors," Rebecca said finally, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, about the old man and the street musician who think they can compete with the major studios using equipment that most people would consider obsolete museum pieces. "I'm here because Elena Vasquez's recording was the most emotionally authentic classical album I've heard in a decade, and she swears that this room and your techniques were responsible for capturing something that she'd never been able to achieve in any other studio." She paused in front of the grand piano and played a few experimental chords, testing the instrument's response and listening to the way the sound moved through the acoustically treated space, and Marcus could see her expression softening slightly as she experienced firsthand the magical properties that made their studio special. Professor Hartwell stepped forward with the quiet dignity of someone defending his life's work, and began to explain the philosophy behind their approach to recording, how they prioritized emotional authenticity over technical perfection, how the vintage equipment added character and warmth that couldn't be replicated by modern digital systems, and how the intimate atmosphere of the studio created a safe space where artists could access their deepest creative reserves. The test came when Rebecca announced that she wanted to record her latest discovery, a young singer-songwriter named Jamie Chen, whose raw emotional power had been consistently undermined by the sterile perfection of the major label studios where she had been working. Jamie arrived that afternoon looking like a deer caught in headlights, her guitar case clutched protectively against her chest and her eyes darting nervously around the studio as if she expected to be ambushed by the kind of soul-crushing criticism that had characterized her previous recording experiences. Marcus recognized something of his own journey in the young woman's defensive posture and took it upon himself to help her feel comfortable in their space, sharing stories of his own transformation from street performer to studio collaborator, and emphasizing how the Hartwell Studios had been designed to nurture rather than intimidate artistic expression. Professor Hartwell watched this interaction with growing appreciation for Marcus's natural ability to connect with artists and help them overcome their fears and insecurities, and he began to understand that their partnership had evolved into something far more sophisticated than he had originally envisioned. The recording session that followed was a masterclass in the delicate art of capturing lightning in a bottle, as Rebecca's technical expertise combined with Marcus's empathetic support and Professor Hartwell's intuitive understanding of how to create the perfect sonic environment for each individual artist's unique voice and style. Jamie's songs were deeply personal explorations of love and loss, family dysfunction and personal growth, and as she performed in the warm glow of the tube amplifiers and the acoustically perfect environment of the studio, her voice took on a vulnerability and power that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Rebecca worked the mixing console with the precision of a surgeon, but she also knew when to step back and let the magic happen naturally, and Marcus found himself learning valuable lessons about the balance between technical control and artistic spontaneity that separated good recordings from truly transcendent ones. Professor Hartwell contributed his own insights about microphone placement and signal processing, his decades of experience proving invaluable in creating the perfect sonic framework for Jamie's emotionally charged performances. And as the sessions progressed, all four participants understood that they were creating something special, not just a recording, but a document of artistic breakthrough and personal transformation. By the end of the week-long session, Jamie had recorded what would later be recognized as one of the year's most important debut albums, and Rebecca Sterling had become one of the studio's most passionate advocates, recommending their services to a carefully selected roster of artists who she believed would benefit from the unique combination of technical excellence and emotional support that Fraukus and Professor Hartwell provided. The success of the sessions marked a turning point in the studio's evolution from a personal restoration project to a legitimate commercial enterprise that was beginning to attract national attention from industry professionals who had grown tired of the cookie-cutter perfection that characterized most modern recording facilities. Professor Hartwell found himself fielding calls from music journalists who wanted to write feature articles about the renaissance of analog recording techniques, while Marcus discovered that his reputation as both a technical expert and artist whisperer was spreading through the tight-knit community of musicians and producers who understood that great recordings required more than just expensive equipment and flawless acoustics. The studio had become a beacon of hope for artists who believed that music should touch the soul as well as the ear, and as winter gave way to spring, both men knew that they had succeeded in creating something that honored the past while pointing toward a brighter future for the art of recorded music. What does it take to believe in yourself when the whole world seems to doubt your vision? Share with us in the comments what time of day you're reading this, and tell us about a moment when someone unexpected believed in your dreams and changed the trajectory of your life. The turning point in their relationship came on a warm April evening when Professor Hartwell collapsed in the control room during a particularly intense mastering session, his face pale and his breathing labored, as Marcus rushed to his side with a terror that transcended professional concern and revealed the depth of affection that had grown between the unlikely partners over the months of shared labor and artistic triumph. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but those few moments of uncertainty, watching the man who had become both mentor and father figure struggle for breath while surrounded by the equipment that represented his life's passion, forced Marcus to confront the reality that their partnership however magical and transformative it had been, existed within the fragile boundaries of human mortality. Professor Hartwell's hospitalization lasted only 3 days, with doctors diagnosing exhaustion and stress rather than anything more serious, but the incident served as a wake-up call that prompted both men to have conversations they had been avoiding about the future of the studio and their roles within it. The old man's brush with his own limitations had reminded him that legacies were not preserved through individual effort alone, but through the careful cultivation and mentorship of the next generation who would carry the torch forward when the original keepers of the flame could no longer maintain their vigil. During his recovery, Professor Hartwell made a decision that surprised even Marcus with its generosity and foresight. He legally transferred 50% ownership of the studio to his young partner, along with full authority to make operational decisions and artistic choices that would shape the direction of their enterprise for years to come. The gesture was both a recognition of Marcus's contributions to the studio's success and an acknowledgement that the business had grown beyond what one person could manage effectively, but more importantly, it represented a level of trust and respect that moved Marcus to tears as he realized the magnitude of what was being offered to him. The legal documents were signed in the studio itself, surrounded by the equipment that had brought them together and the gold records that testified to their shared achievements, and as Professor Hartwell placed the pen in Marcus's hand and guided him through the signature process, both men understood that they were formalizing a bond that had transcended mere business partnership and evolved into something approaching family. The ceremony was witnessed by Elena Vasquez and Jamie Chen, whose successful recordings had helped establish the studio's reputation, and the small gathering felt more like a wedding or adoption than a simple transfer of business assets. The spring and summer months brought a flood of new projects that tested the limits of their expanded operation, as word-of-mouth recommendations and industry buzz generated more booking requests than they could realistically accommodate without compromising the quality and personal attention that had become their trademark. Marcus found himself growing into his new role as co-owner and artistic director, his natural empathy with musicians combining with the technical skills Professor Hartwell had taught him to create a management style that artists found both professional and nurturing. The older man stepped back from the day-to-day operations, but remained actively involved as senior consultant and master engineer, his presence in the control room providing both technical expertise and the kind of gravitas that came from decades of experience in capturing musical magic. Together, they developed a careful vetting process for potential clients, turning away projects that didn't align with their artistic vision while welcoming artists who understood that they were entering a space where music was treated as something sacred rather than merely commercial, and their selective approach only enhanced the studio's reputation as a destination for serious musicians who were willing to invest the time and emotional energy required to create truly exceptional recordings. The most ambitious project of their partnership's second year came when David Chen, a renowned film composer and Jamie's older brother, approached them about recording the orchestral score for an independent film that would require the kind of intimate, emotionally nuanced sound that major studios often struggled to achieve despite their vastly superior resources and equipment. The project would push both their technical capabilities and their artistic vision to new limits, requiring them to accommodate a 40-piece orchestra in a space that had been designed for much smaller ensembles. But Marcus and Professor Hartwell embraced the challenge with the enthusiasm of artists who understood that growth came through pushing boundaries rather than playing it safe. The logistics alone were staggering: renting additional microphones, reconfiguring the studio layout to accommodate the expanded ensemble, and coordinating recording sessions with musicians whose schedules were already packed with symphonic and chamber music commitments. But the artistic possibilities were even more exciting as they contemplated the opportunity to capture the full dynamic range and the emotional complexity of a major orchestral work, using their unique combination of vintage equipment and modern techniques. The orchestral sessions stretched over 2 weeks in late summer, transforming the studio into a hive of controlled chaos as musicians arrived each morning with instruments ranging from delicate violins to massive timpani, and Marcus marveled at Professor Hartwell's ability to maintain technical precision while managing the complex interpersonal dynamics that inevitably emerged when so many creative 5 personalities were gathered in such close quarters. The old man's reputation in the classical music world proved invaluable in earning the respect and cooperation of musicians who might have been skeptical about recording in a facility that lacked the size and institutional prestige of the major symphonic venues where they typically worked, and his gentle but authoritative presence in the control room provided the kind of leadership that allowed very one to focus on making music rather than worrying about technical details or logistical complications. Marcus served as both technical assistant and diplomatic liaison, his youth and enthusiasm helping to bridge the gap between Professor Hartwell's formal approach and the more relaxed atmosphere that many of the younger musicians preferred. And together, they created an environment where artistic excellence could flourish without the pretension and ego battles that often plagued high-stakes recordi. Projects. The final sessions produced some of the most emotionally powerful orchestral recordings that either man had ever been involved with, and as they listened to the playback through their carefully calibrated monitors, surrounded by the controlled chaos of packing up instruments and equipment, both Marcus and Professor Hartwell knew that they had achieved something that would stand as a testament to their partnership and to the transformative power of treating music as something worthy of reverence and dedication. Have you ever been part of a team where everyone's individual talents combined to create something greater than any of you could have achieved alone? Tell us in the comments what part of the world you're reading from, and share a story about a time when collaboration transformed your understanding of what was possible. 5 years after that first encounter on the street corner, where Marcus had played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the Hartwell Studios had become legendary throughout the music industry as a place where technical excellence merged seamlessly with artistic soul, where musicians from around the world came not just to record their music, but to rediscover their passion for the craft that had called for them to dedicate their lives to sound and melody. The studio's walls were now lined with platinum and gold records, representing every genre from classical to jazz to indie rock, each one a testament to the magic that occurred when artists were given the perfect combination of vintage warmth and modern precision, guided by 2 men who understood that great recordings were born from the marriage of technical expertise and emotional authenticity. Professor Hartwell, now in his 70s but energized by the success of their partnership, had become something of a celebrity in audio engineering circles, frequently invited to speak at conferences and universities about the art of analog recording and the importance of preserving musical heritage in an increasingly digital world. Marcus had evolved from street performer to master engineer, his name appearing in the credits of Grammy-winning albums, and his reputation for nurturing artistic excellence, drawing young musicians from conservatories and coffee shops alike to seek his guidance in translating their creative visions into recorded form. The anniversary celebration they hosted that autumn brought together every artist who had recorded at the studio over the years, transforming the space into a reunion of musical family members who had shared in the magic of creating something beautiful and lasting within these acoustically perfect walls. Elena Vasquez performed her original compositions with the same string quartet that had inaugurated the studio's renaissance, while Jamie Chen sang the songs that had launched her career and brought her international recognition as one of her generation's most authentic voices, and David Chen conducted a chamber orchestra in excerpts from the film score that had established the studio's reputation, then for handling large-scale orchestral projects. Professor Hartwell moved through the gathering like a proud patriarch, sharing stories and memories with artists who had become not just clients, but cherished members of an extended family, bound together by their commitment to musical excellence and their appreciation for the rare environment that Marcus and the professor had created. Marcus watched from behind the mixing console, where he had spent countless hours learning his craft, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him from the uncertainty and loneliness of street performance to the fulfillment and purpose of serving as a guardian of musical heritage and a mentor to the next generation of artists. The most moving moment of the evening came when Professor Hartwell took the stage to speak about his son David and the vision they had shared for what the studio could become, his voice strong and clear as he explained how Marcus had helped him transform grief into celebration, abandonment into renewal, and silence into the most beautiful music he had ever heard. David always believed that music was humanity's most direct connection to the divine, the professor said, his eyes glistening with tears of joy rather than sorrow. And I know that he would be amazed and proud to see how his studio has become a sanctuary where that divine connection is nurtured and preserved for future generations to discover and cherish. The audience rose in a spontaneous standing ovation that seemed to last forever, and Marcus felt his heart swelling with the knowledge that they had succeeded in creating something that honored the past while building toward a future where music would continue to heal and inspire and transform lives in ways both subtle and profound. The applause gradually gave way to an impromptu jam session that lasted until dawn, with artists from different genres and generations collaborating on musical conversations that had never been recorded but would live forever in the memories of everyone who witnessed them. As the last guests departed and the morning sun streamed through the studio windows, Marcus and Professor Hartwell sat together at the grand piano where their partnership had begun, playing the four-handed arrangement of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major that had become their signature piece and their private anthem of renewal and hope. The music flowed between them with the effortless communication of old friends who no longer needed words to express their deepest thoughts and feelings, and the studio itself seemed to pulse with contentment and satisfaction, as if the room understood that its purpose had been fully realized and its potential completely fulfilled. The vintage equipment hummed quietly around them, ready to capture the next generation of musical magic, while the gold records on the walls testified to the transformative power of believing in beauty even when the world seemed determined to abandon it. Professor Hartwell looked at Marcus with eyes that sparkled with pride and affection, and in that moment, both men understood that they had achieved something far more valuable than commercial success or industry recognition. They had proved that abandonment was not a permanent condition, that with patience and dedication and love, even the most wounded places could be restored to glory that exceeded their original beauty. The final notes of the nocturne faded into the perfect silence of the studio, and as Marcus and Professor Hartwell sat together in the golden morning light, surrounded by the tools of their trade and the evidence of their shared achievements, they knew that their story would continue for years to come, inspiring other artists and dreamers to believe in the possibility of transformation and renew. How the studio would outlive them both, serving future generations of musicians who needed a place where their art could be treated with the reverence and respect it deserved, while their partnership would stand as a testament to the power of mentorship and collaboration to create something beautiful from the ashes of loss and disappointment. The street musician and the grieving collector had become the guardians of a musical sanctuary, and their story had become a song of hope that would echo through the years, reminding everyone who heard it that abandonment was never the end of the story, but simply the beginning of a new chapter where wounded souls could find healing and purpose in the service of something greater than themselves. Music had brought them together, transformed them both, and given them a legacy that would inspire countless others to believe in the possibility of restoration, renewal, and the eternal power of human creativity to triumph over the forces of despair and abandonment. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of music, healing, and transformation. Tell us in the comments where in the world you experienced this story, and share with us